be updating my rankings. We got Oregon still at number one. They blew out Illinois at 38-9, who I fully expected them to blow out. And Illinois was 6-1 going into that game, so no reason why Oregon shouldn't still be number one in the country. And then Georgia, I've still got at number two because they didn't play, so no reason to move them up or down. And then I've still got Ohio State at three, ahead of Indiana and Penn State, who I've got at 4 and 5. Because even though Indiana and Penn State are undefeated, and Ohio State has a loss, and Ohio State struggled last week against Nebraska, who is not a great team. You have to remember that even pretty much all of the national championship teams have one bad game at least during the season. And Indiana and Penn State have not played a team near as good as Oregon so far. Now, this will work itself out, though, because Ohio State is going to play Penn State and they're going to play Indiana. So if they lose to those teams, then uh, of course they should be ranked lower than them. But Indiana got the win over Washington, 31-17 last Saturday. That was decent, especially with their quarterback Rourke being out in that game. Who is a really good quarterback. And Penn State did decent last Saturday also when they got the win 28-13 over Wisconsin. And their quarterback Aller didn't play any of the second half of that game. And then Miami, I've still got it at number six. So they blew out Florida State 36-14, who is, if they're not the worst Power Four team, they're the second worst Power Four team, with Mississippi State being the worst. And even though they only gave up 14 points to Florida State, I've still got concerns about Miami's defense because Florida State doesn't have an offense this year anyway. And then number seven, I've got BYU. So they got the win over Central Florida, who is a horrible team at 37-24. So they did okay. So they didn't change in my rankings. And then I've got Iowa State still at number eight because they didn't play, so there's no reason to move them up or down. And then I moved Notre Dame and Texas A&M ahead of Texas because Notre Dame has the win over Texas A&M. Even though I think Texas A&M would beat Notre Dame if they played again, and Texas A&M got the very impressive 15-point win over LSU, while Texas got a very unimpressive 3-point win over Vanderbilt. So Notre Dame last Saturday destroyed Navy 51-14, which I fully expected them to do. Navy, even though they were undefeated, they hadn't played anyone any good until they played Notre Dame. So that's why I never had them ranked in my rankings, because I didn't think they were actually very good. And then Texas, even though they've not done very well in these past two games, I still think they're very likely going to the college football playoff because their last four games are against Florida, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Texas A&M, and the next three are very likely going to be wins, and that means that they're either going to go 11-1 or 10-2, with the other loss being to Texas A&M, most likely, which would get them in the college football playoff, very likely, with them being a SEC team. And then Tennessee, I've got at number 12. No real reason to change them much because they didn't play this week. And then Kansas State, I've got at number 13. So they just barely got the win over Kansas last Saturday at 29 to 27. And before the season began, that score would have sounded about right because I thought Kansas State was better than Kansas, but I thought they were pretty similar. But now that does not look like a very impressive win for Kansas State because Kansas has gone back to their old ways of being horrible. And then at 14, I've got LSU. I didn't move them down much because even though they did lose by 15 points, it was a road loss to a very good team. And then Ole Miss, I've got it 15. So they were pretty much a completely different team in the second half of the Oklahoma game than they were in the first half. The first half they were awful. The second half they were very good. But still, Ole Miss's biggest problem is their offensive line. It's got to do a much better job of opening up holes for their running backs so they can get their run game going, and they've got to do a much better job of protecting Jackson Dart. And then number 16, I've got Alabama. So last Saturday when they beat Missouri 34 to nothing, that was the best they've played since the first half of the Georgia game. Until that uh, game against Missouri, from that time uh, all the way back to the second half of the Georgia game, Alabama had looked like an average football team. But Alabama still has a chance to go to the college football playoff, in my opinion. So if they can beat LSU, which is their next opponent, I think they become a likely team to go to the college football playoff because their last three opponents are Mercer, which is an easy win, and then Oklahoma and Auburn, which are likely wins. And then number 17, I've got Pittsburgh. So they blew out Syracuse last week at 41 to 13. But I'm still not ready to put Pittsburgh in the top 15 yet because the ACC is horrible and they still don't have a win against a good team yet. But Pittsburgh is obviously a whole lot better than they were supposed to be, and they'll have opportunities to get better wins this season because they're going to play SMU and Clemson. And then Clemson, I've got at number 18 because even though they're 7-1, their one loss was against the one good team they've played all season, Georgia, and it was a blowout loss. Since then, they've just been beating up on terrible teams. And SMU, I've got it 19. So they got the win last Saturday in overtime against Duke, 28 to 27 on the road, which wasn't a bad win because Duke had the same record as SMU going into that game. And then Boise State, I've got it 20. So at 6-1, with the only loss being a close one to the number one team in the country, they are looking pretty good. So they got a close win last week over UNLV, 29 to 24, who is a conference opponent, and it wasn't a bad win for Boise State. It was UNLV has been pretty good this year too. They're 6-2 with a couple of Power Four wins. And then Washington State, I've got it number 21. Now you do have to remember with them that they're not playing a Power Four schedule completely this year because they're an independent. I just have them ranked because of their 7-1 record. But the best team they've played so far is probably Boise State, who blew them out. So I actually doubt that Washington State is a real top 25 team. And then Duke, I've got it at 22. So they actually ended up moving up in my rankings, even though they lost. Duke is much better this year than they were supposed to be. They seem like a team that could possibly get even more wins than they did last season with what seems like a worse roster. And then Illinois, I've got it 23. Didn't really change them much because even though they got blown out, it was to the number one team in the country right now, and it was expected to happen. And then Missouri, I've got it at number 24. So even though I do think they would have scored some points on Alabama with Brady Cook being healthy, I do think that Missouri is just not that good of a team this year. And then Colorado, I've got it number 25. Was I wrong when I thought that Colorado was going to be one of the worst teams in the country this year? Yes, they have done better this year than I thought they would do. But was I wrong when I said that Deion Sanders isn't actually serious about building up a dominant football program at Colorado? I don't think so. Deion Sanders has a quarterback at Shedeur Sanders, who is going to be a first round pick, and Travis Hunter, who's going to be a first round pick that plays on both sides of the ball that I think are making him look good this season. And when Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter leave after this season, Colorado, I think, will go back to being terrible again. And I think Deion Sanders will leave with them because he won't have any interest in being there anymore. And he's not going to get another quarterback as good as Shedeur Sanders or another athlete as good as Travis Hunter. And then you also do have to remember that Colorado, even though they're 6-2, they've only played two teams that are either decent or good. They played Nebraska, who's a decent team, and lost, and then they played Kansas State, who's a good team, and lost, and then they played six bad teams and beat all of them. And even though Colorado could end up having a very good record at the end of the season, a lot of this success they're having is because the Big 12 conference has turned out to be trash this year. This is the worst that conference has been probably ever. So many teams that were supposed to be good in that conference this year have turned out to be terrible. Like Oklahoma State was supposed to be good, they're terrible. Utah was supposed to be good, they're terrible. And Arizona was supposed to be good, they're terrible. Kansas was supposed to be good, and they're terrible. And West Virginia was supposed to be pretty good, and they're bad. So Colorado, I think, is taking advantage of that this season. But that will be it with this video, and please subscribe, and thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.